So, before we start talking about gender and society in the ancient world, I just want to spend a little bit of time going over some key terms and definitions related to the topic in terms of how we understand them today in modern society, because that will be relevant to our discussions. So, firstly, we need to talk about the difference between sex and gender. So, sex relates to your biological or physiological characteristics. So, think of it as more a scientific term. And we've got the biologically recognized sexes of male and female, as well as intersex. Then we also have what's described as gender, and gender is a social construct. So different societies will have different ideas about how many genders there are, what genders are, and what those genders look like. And so these terms interact with one another. Sex and gender can be linked, but it's important to be aware that they are different from one another. And when we're looking at these sort of sociological topics, it's important to be aware of these terms and what their definitions are. In terms of what a society means, the sociological definition of that is a group of people who have something in common to do with their territory, their interactions, their culture. And so the assessment specifications for the Scholarship Classical Studies exam is gender and society. And so that suggests that what we're going to need to do is look at the relationship between both gender and society. And so the question that we need to be asking ourselves as we go through these various topics is how are Greek and Roman gender beliefs, gender roles, gender relationships, and so on shaped by their cultures? What ideas and values about ancient Greece and ancient Rome do we see come through in the gender topics, and how also are those gender beliefs shaped by their cultures? So now that we've got that underway and we've got that sort of basic understanding, we're going to move on to have a very basic, simple overview of what the norms and expectations are on women in Greek society, as well as having a quick look at some exceptions to those rules. So firstly, as with anything when we're studying ancient Greece, it's quite difficult to make generalizations because ancient Greece isn't one unified empire like ancient Rome. It's a collection of city-states known as polis. And so each polis has different ideas and values, and some of those are drastically different, like when you compare Athens and Sparta. However, a generalization that we can make is that all Greek states were patriarchies. Women were never seen as equals, but women's status in relation to men was slightly different depending on what city-state you were in. And Athens, which we focus on in our level 2 course, is our most extreme example of a patriarchy in ancient Greece, because the position of women was so drastically different to that of men. Women were largely powerless and couldn't really do anything, whereas they had more freedoms in other societies such as Sparta. There's a couple of nice quotes from primary sources here to indicate what the status of women was in Athenian society. So we've got a quote here from Plutarch talking about even the status of goddesses. There's a snake beside the statue of Athena because she's a virgin and virgins need guarding, whereas Aphrodite, the goddess of love, is accompanied by a tortoise, suggesting the link between domesticity and silence with married women. So even the goddesses are used to reflect these ideas and values. This quote here is an extract from Thucydides' funeral oration, Pericles' funeral oration as delivered in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. And Pericles is talking to the women of Athens, saying, "Your greatest glory is to be as good as your nature allows," a bit of a backhanded compliment there, "and your greatest fame is to be least talked of among men, whether for good or ill. So women really shouldn't be seen or heard in Athenian society if they want to live up to expectations. So in terms of generalizations we can make around women's lives, if your house was big enough, women would live in separate quarters known as the gynoeceum, and they tended to have quite separate lives from male family members, and definitely from men outside their family that have next to no contact with. So a young girl's life would be spent in the home. Her mum would be teaching her, getting her ready for marriage. So you might have a small amount of basic education, enough to run a household, maybe a little bit of music, a lot of spinning, weaving, managing slaves, household chores, that kind of thing. She's really being prepared for her role as a housewife and a mother. Their father would arrange marriages, and so their focus was on how to improve the standing of the family. So they'd be wanting to make a really good connection through marrying off their daughter, and they would have to provide their daughters with a dowry, which can make having a daughter less attractive because you've got to pay to get rid of her, so to speak. Once women were married, they were expected to produce children and raise them to be heirs for their husband and new citizens for their polis. They need to assist their husbands managing the household so that they could go out and perform their civic duties. And of course, by producing children, they're also contributing to the state by making new citizens. And overall, women tended to be defined by their relationships to men. They're often described as mother of or wife of, daughter of. They don't tend to have their own identity, which really just shows by their names their position and status in Greek society. This extract here, and you may want to pause the video and actually have a good read through it, or have a look at it on your handout, is a really famous extract from Euripides' play about Medea. And so here we have a woman speaking, although a man has written her words, talking about how much life sucks to be a woman in ancient Greece, ancient Athens. Women are the most wretched of all creatures that have life and thought. Talking about how hard it is to get married. You're really up to placing your hands in fate, really, to see whether you have a good husband or a bad husband and what your life's going to be like, the difficulties of married life, and if you don't have a good husband, it's better to die. You are completely reliant on that one man. And at the end as well, she also says that the physical difficulty of being a woman, I'd rather stand in the front line and battle 3 times than bear a child once. And certainly so many women would die in childbirth. It was such a dangerous thing. So Medea's character here captures this quite nicely about how horrible life could be for a woman in ancient Greece. This extract was actually in the 2022 scholarship exam, so it sort of sums up the topic quite nicely. Now that we've had a look at sort of the typical lives of women in Greece, and in particular in Athens, we'll have a quick look through some exceptions to what was typical. So as I said before, Sparta's, while a patriarchy wasn't as male dominated to the same extent as Athens, they believed that their women played a very important role in creating good Spartan warriors, and so the girls would have a bit more freedom, and the women as well. So unlike in Athens and other Greek states, girls were educated by the state until they were 18, because it was seen as so important to have these women, these Spartan mothers, have such a good knowledge of Spartan values, because they are responsible for instilling them into their children, the next generation of Spartans. And as well as being academically educated, they would also have physical training, because it was believed that if they were good, strong Spartan women, they were fit and they were healthy, then they would be able to produce fit, healthy, strong babies. If you're interested in this do have a look through marriage in Sparta, because it's quite fascinating about some of the rites and rituals they have. And one really interesting thing they had was wife sharing, where if a older man had a young wife and they weren't able to have children, instead of divorcing her, he would let her go and find another fitter, healthier, more virile man to sleep with, and so that she could produce children with him. They would be her husband's children legally, but she could go and sort of source the sperm for that elsewhere, because their priority is creating a really strong future generation. Women were also able to own property in Sparta, and so the dowry was not required. So their legal status was slightly different as well. So there are some quite fascinating differences between women in Athens and women in Sparta. So it's well worth having a closer look at if you find this interesting. Another exception to how women tended to be depicted in the Greek world were the Amazons, a well-known tribe, mythological, of famous female warriors. They didn't have any men, and they were able to fight really bravely, and they even came to help the Trojans in the Trojan War, fighting against the Greeks. And we think that these mythological warriors were probably based on tribes from Scythia to the north of Greece, where we see some evidence that women would fight alongside men as well. And finally, another exception to the expectations of Athenian women and typical Greek women were the hetairae, or companions. And so these would be women who were highly educated, prostitutes, sex workers. So they did sell their company, and they would accompany men to symposia or drinking parties. So they would be seen as a woman that you'd actually want to have a conversation with. They were valued for their wit, their intelligence, their knowledge of the world and music and so on, whereas men wouldn't have that same expectation of their wives, probably because of the age difference and how sheltered these good Athenian girls were. So some women did have different lives, and were depicted as having different lives to the ones we've talked about previously, but these tend to be exceptions to the norm. And just as a quick image, we've got here a very famous black figure amphora by Exekius, showing Achilles killing the Amazon queen Penthesilea, and so we can see the white paint here to reflect the fact that she is female. Woman, the sign of beauty was to have white skin, because it suggested that you were inside at home all day, and they've kept this artistic convention even for a female warrior who presumably didn't spend much time inside cooking and cleaning. Another point I want to touch on is the idea that which the Greeks had, which the Romans also took on and believed in themselves, about the inferiority of men. So they believed that women were inferior to men for several reasons. They believed that women weren't able to manage their impulses. They didn't have the same amount of self-control as men had, and instead they were often subject to things like lust, decadence. They really liked spending money on pretty things, drinking, partying, having sex. So it was the role of men to keep women under control, because if they were left to their own devices, they wouldn't be able to cope. And as well as this, they believed that if women weren't under the control of men, their emotions and chaotic characters would be a threat to the kind of calm, intelligent logic which men had. So there's quite a famous quote here from Aristotle: "The male is by nature superior, the female inferior. One rules, the other is ruled." And this is part of a larger text where he's also talking about how some people are meant to be slaves and some people are meant to be masters, and how humans are meant to be in control and animals are meant to be controlled by them. So this was taken as a biological fact by the Greeks. And again, you might want to pause this one and have a look through this source from Hesiod's Works and Days. It's a very old work. It's advice that he's giving to his brother. Don't let a sexy woman take you in with her coaxing and flattery. She's really after your barn. So some great lines in here talking about the sort of woman that you want to find, the one who will be the right wife, not cause you problems, the importance of choosing carefully when you have a wife. So some quite nice things here. So if you haven't had a look through this source in a previous year, make sure you have a good look through it because there's some nice pieces in here. What we're going to do in the tutorial is have a look through a couple more sources. So I've got one here from Aristophanes' Lysistrata. It's a comedy where women go on a sex strike to stop the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. And then I thought we could also have a look at this vase painting here, showing some women who seem to be figures from the Trojan War. And it's basically a toilet scene where they're getting ready and looking beautiful and so on a pyxis or a cosmetics jar. So that's what we'll have a look at and discuss together. See you in the tutorial.